everyone, welcome back to Professor Jordan's Whys of History, where we still haven't remembered to write a tagline. When last we met, we'd gone over some of the basic motivations for Columbus, and now we're about to get into some detail on the religious and cultural reasons behind Columbus's voyages. Part 2. It gets complicated. At the beginning of this episode, I brought up the idea that many of the consequences of Columbus's voyages were simply unforeseeable. However, there is one facet of his motivations that produced extremely foreseeable results. While the desire for glory and gold was very much relevant to Columbus, I want to expand on that middle point a bit and get into some detail. But before we do that, a word from our sponsors. The following segment is brought to you by air quotes. Air quotes. Good for adding that extra bit of sarcasm and discussing relevant historical terminology that can be misleading and is representative of not exactly true to reality line of thinking. Air quotes. Firstly, many Europeans in Columbus's day, especially those closer to Africa and the Middle East, saw themselves as players in a mighty clash of civilizations between Christendom, or Christian Europe, and the Islamic world. It looked to many Europeans in the Middle Ages that Islam would soon overtake them, as both Islamic religion and Islamic empires were spreading far across the known world. After all, the world Columbus was living in had Christians and Muslims fighting across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Greece to Italy to Syria, and with one big exception, it looked like Islam was winning. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks captured the mighty Greek Orthodox city of Constantinople and began marching into Eastern Europe. And on top of that, Islam itself was taking hold everywhere, from Serbia to sub-Saharan Africa to Singapore to the steppes of Russia. Europeans saw themselves as surrounded by a hostile and untrue faith that threatened their way of life and the religion that they held dear. In our remarkably relevant random fact for today, we look at the fact that while Europeans were terrified of being religiously oppressed by Muslims, it's worth noting that most Muslim authorities throughout the Middle East were generally more religiously tolerant than most Christian authorities were. In fact, many Jews who fled repeated persecution in Europe found sanctuary in the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan who captured Constantinople, Mehmed II, openly invited Jews and Christians into the empire. Under Ottoman rule, Christians, Jews, and other non-Muslims were treated as second-class citizens and had to pay higher taxes, but were able to follow their own sets of laws, were not forced to convert, had their own representation in the Ottoman administration, and could generally live without the fear that a rampaging mob might blame them for a natural disaster, then kill them all, which was more than a lot of religious minorities in Christian Europe could claim. So compared to the rest of Christendom, the only country that was actually winning our clash of civilizations was, you guessed it, Spain. And Ferdinand and Isabella took it upon themselves to turn the tide and defeat the Muslims everywhere. So when an Italian explorer came to them and claimed that he could find a way to the east that didn't involve crossing through Muslim territory or sailing all the bloody way around Africa, they funded his voyage in hopes that he could begin the Christianization of China and India. The line of thinking being that with the peoples of the East Catholicized, the Spanish monarchy believed they could attack the Islamic world from two sides, defeating their old enemies and winning this clash of civilizations for the side of Christianity. But not only would the peoples of Asia get a piping hot dose of Christianity, Columbus and the Spanish monarchy sought to civilize or Europeanize the people they encountered. While spreading Christianity to non-Christians could debatably be a good thing, depending on your perspective, perhaps, the notion that one group of people needs to civilize another is really just ethnocentrism and racism. Let's not forget that most Europeans, Columbus included, had an extremely limited, if any, understanding of Asian culture or people to begin with. So they went out assuming that Asian people would simply adopt Christianity and European culture because anyone who wasn't European was inferior and would therefore jump at the chance to make themselves better. Let's also not forget that Columbus was ready to use and consistently used force, including rape, torture, and enslavement to accomplish his goals. So it's not like he brought Christianity and European culture with hugs and sunshine and mutual understanding. I belabor this point for the sake of diving into Columbus's motivations, and to note that while there are certain effects of his adventures that he certainly couldn't have foreseen, it's not like he acted in the name of humanism and kindness. Part 3, my thoughts. Well, just my thoughts on this issue could cover a whole video in and of itself, but I'll hit one big idea surrounding Columbus's voyages themselves. While Columbus's feat is nothing to scoff at, and he deserves credit for crossing a never-before-crossed ocean, if we compare his results to what he set out to do, he was kind of a colossal failure. Columbus had not found his supposed route to Asia, he had not begun the Christianization of Asia, and he was not loaded up in spices and bling. Yet the fact that he was A, not dead or lost at sea, and B, had brought back captives as proof that he had discovered somewhere new, meant he was given more money and more ships for his next adventure. If that wasn't enough, one of the reasons we call the Americas and not Columbus land is due to the fact that Columbus went to his grave adamantly refusing to accept that he had hit somewhere other than Asia, while Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci was probably the first explorer to publicly declare that what Columbus had found was not part of Asia. It is somewhat ironic then that while Columbus himself was not all that successful, his actions would bring about one of the largest series of changes in human history, all of which fall well into the realm of unforeseeable by Columbus himself. The diseases he and explorers that followed him brought to the Americas would kill 90% of some Native American societies, who may have numbered between 50 and 100 million across North and South America before Columbus arrived, all of whom had no immunity to old world diseases like smallpox and malaria. Columbus's adventures explain why we often associate tomatoes with pasta sauce and Italian cuisine, and potatoes with Ireland and Idaho, despite the fact that tomatoes are native to a small area of Mexico and potatoes to the mountains of Peru. Columbus's encounters would bring about one of the first examples of a truly global world, as silver mined in Bolivia by native South Americans and Africans was shipped to the Philippines by Spanish sailors to be traded with Chinese merchants for silk to make clothing bought in France. Whew. Issues like this present a tough question in historical circles, bringing us to our "so it turns out history is complicated" segment of this episode. So I ask of you, dear viewer, where does Columbus stand in the name of responsibility for these massive changes, both for the incredible benefits and the horrific suffering that came with it? Not only was knowledge of the diseases he introduced well out of his realm of understanding, he never reached any of North America and never came in contact with a fraction of the people or resources his successors would get rich exploiting. However, he was incredibly brutal to his crew and the native people he encountered, to the point where his governorship and claims over the lands he had found was revoked by the Spanish government. This discussion is important, as Columbus Day is a national holiday in the United States, and I think it's necessary to think about whether or not a man like Columbus should be celebrated. For the tens of millions of Native Americans who had their cultures overridden, their people utterly obliterated, and their livelihoods forcibly taken from them, Columbus seems like a historical figure to be justifiably hated for the human suffering he unleashed. Yet, without his actions, I, speaking English, yet in the middle of North America, roughly 4,000 miles away from England, certainly would not exist. And the wealth, goods, and foods that Columbus opened up to Europe would drastically increase the standard of living, overall health, and life expectancy of millions across the globe. Not only does Columbus get a national holiday in the United States, we even named our capital, the District of Columbia, after him. Streets, cities, plazas, parks, and even a whole country are named after Columbus. Honestly, I think it's kind of funny that one of the most important events in human history was conducted by someone who could easily be seen as a failure, and who was driven by personal pride, religious vehemence, and material greed. So, how do we characterize Columbus as a historical figure? Is he someone to be despised or revered, or both or neither? Does he, or anyone for that matter, deserve recognition for the actions that they helped inspire? Should one's motivations be considered when weighing the morality or righteousness of their actions? And of course, how do we handle such a massive and world-changing legacy when it involves so many consequences that were simply unforeseeable? These are tough questions, and seeing as I only deal with why questions, I pass them on to you. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have questions, concerns, philosophical discussions, as well as other whys of history you'd like answered or topics you'd like discussed, throw them in a comment. I appreciate your time. I am Professor Jordan, and I will see you all next class. Let's start with "and the wealth." You can start there, because that is a really long sentence. Can I say I love commas? I have a love affair with commas.
I noticed.
Maybe I'm compensating for something. All my long sentences.
You're compensating?
Compensating. Okay.